there, I'm Kimberly HayDay Muga.
And I'm Amanda Day.
And you're listening to Fundraising HayDay,
where we cover the how-tos of grants and fundraising.
And how we can all do a better job of changing the world through philanthropy.
And a special shout out to our Patreon subscribers who help make this podcast possible. To join this amazing community with things like a monthly curated playlist, a monthly book club, monthly wide open mistakes were made episodes, plus our monthly musings with Kimberly. Just visit our website, which is patreon.com/fundraising HayDay. We'd love to see you there.
That's right.
Today, we're talking about something that has massive implications for every single person doing grant work right now. Whether you work at a nonprofit, at a local government, university, consulting firm, wherever, if grants are part of your world, you need to know about this, because if you're involved with federal funding as a direct recipient, a subrecipient, a pass-through entity, whatever, this subject is going to affect you. So stay tuned. We are so excited to introduce you, our listeners, to the second half, Season 9 sponsor of the Fundraising HayDay podcast. The Encore Institute for Social Impact partners with nonprofit organizations to secure funding, develop actionable strategies, strengthen capacity, and demonstrate results. We're joined by Shelley Latham, GPC, founder and CEO of Encore, to learn more about their work with a mini-series during the second 12 episodes of this season. So Shelley, on the last episode, we talked about the evolution of Encore from grant writing to strategy and sustainability. What does Encore's work with agencies look like today?
Yeah, so Encore really did evolve through grant work, and grants and funding strategy are still a very important part of what we do. But over time, organizations started asking for support with things like planning, effective communication, training, those types of things. A lot of nonprofits are really trying to navigate rapid change while still serving communities effectively. And that's really hard when internal systems or communication practices aren't keeping pace. So today, our work also helps organizations strengthen how they operate internally so they can sustain their impact over time, especially during periods of uncertainty. We still see funding as a critically important part of what we do, but we do view sustainability as something much broader than revenue alone.
Well, that's absolutely true.
To find out more about this incredible team with expertise across all aspects of nonprofit operations and how to hire them, visit EncoreISI.com. Encore is committed to being the most effective and highest value partner possible. So we wanted to explore, having reviewed the proposed changes to the uniform guidance, we wanted to explore some key areas. And just FYI, uniform guidance, if you're new to grants, is the 2 CFR Part 200, which used to be guidance for how to manage grants and other federal funds. And was and still is developed through the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. But they have proposed, not a surprise to anyone. We've been talking about this for a while in the classes that we teach and the webinars and other stuff. We knew that changes were coming. And so the proposed changes are here. You have till July the 13th to review and make public comments on them. And then whatever changes will take place after the comment process are supposedly going to be put in place October the 1st, which is the start of the fiscal federal year. And we'll have some more details about the commenting and all of those things later on, but I just wanted to set the stage.
Yeah, public comments due July 13th. So if you haven't heard about it, now's the time, and now's the time to get on making those comments.
And if you are starting to listen to this podcast and you work or you have a client that is a small nonprofit that never, ever will ever get government funding, okay, this may not be the episode for you, fair warning, but we just are going to cover a lot of ground. And I do think ultimately it is going to affect us all. And I just think it's an important thing to talk about. So let's roll with it. So Amanda, why don't you get us started with maybe a little more of a definition of uniform guidance and why it matters.
Yeah. I've been reading up more on this, and what's fascinating to me is like we started having some guidelines, and for a while it was like there was this circular and there was this circular and there was this set of rules and there was this set of rules. And so there were all these different things, right? But they finally brought them all together under one thing called uniform guidance. The official name, 2 CFR Part 200. So CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. So 2 CFR Part 200. And it's basically this master rule book. If you have anything to do with federal funding, not just grants, but federal funds. So the federal agencies are supposed to follow this. Our president is supposed to follow this. Or, if we receive federal funds, whether it's a cooperative agreement or those kinds of things, we're supposed to follow this, right? So it basically standardizes requirements for how you apply for funds, how you manage those funds, how if you have subrecipients, how you're managing your subrecipients. It's kind of like the rule book for what to do with the money, the programs, the activities, all of the things. It tells you what costs are allowable, what costs are not allowable, what audits look like. It is the rule book for people dealing with federal funds.
So what do you think the deal is with OMB and why they're doing it now, what they say they're going to do? Because I know there's some really inflammatory language that kicks this off. We're trying not to dwell on that, I know, but I just want to say when you start reading it, it may make you angry. Or it may not, or you may think it's the best thing since sliced bread, in which case, okay then. But I would urge you to read the rest of it because that's really, it's blustery language is one thing, but there's some other things. So what is your opinion on why they say they're doing this?
Well, first of all, I will say, as I was reading it, I'm reading things, I'm copying some things verbatim so I could gather my thoughts around it. And one of the things that was helpful for me was creating a document that's literally for my eyes only, is just have my own running commentary of, oh my gosh, they said this. And then I still annoyed by it, but it felt good to just get it out. So then but I'm like, okay, but I can be mad about it, but that doesn't change that this is what's happening. So I need to calm down and focus and really understand what's going on. So what this document is saying, the proposed changes, is that there are 3 goals that the government is trying to achieve as a result of these proposed changes. Okay. So they want to improve transparency and accountability. Okay. Which that's not a bad thing, right? They want to elevate the Office of Management and Budget edicts from guidance to formal regulations. In other words, what are some things that this administration has been pushing through memos and executive orders and things that now they're trying to codify it, give it some teeth by having it in the uniform guidance. And then they want to reduce regulatory burden on federal grant administrators and grantees. So that's what I'm saying the purpose of it is.
Like on the surface, okay, but really what they're proposing, there are just a lot of red flags about how they're going to go about doing this. And let me say, before we get all into this, their reform in a positive, thoughtful way for many of these processes would be a good thing. But my interpretation of what I read is that's really not what's going on here.
Well, we both were super excited about the changes that went into effect back in 2024. They made nice changes that were helpful to grantees and streamlined some things and helped with accountability. So all of those things can be done. It just depends how you go about it, right? Anyway.
Yeah. And also I think it's also moving from uniform guidance to uniform regulation. And that's a different take on it, which will have lots of implications if you're super familiar with uniform guidance. It's not always super specific. They just say you got to do these things, but they don't tell you how to do them. So taking it to a regulation,
yes,
ups the ante in not a very good way. But anyway, I digress.
So we're going to share a lot of links and resources that we talk about, and all of these we will share in the show notes. So if you're like, ooh, that sounds amazing, how do I access it? Check out the show notes, which you can find on our website, and whatever platform you're listening to, those notes will be as part of the comment section, right? So you can find those. But the National Council of Nonprofits released a thorough comment guide in June of 2026, describing the proposed changes as, and this is in their words, creating significant financial risk and instability for federal grantees. Okay, so that's what they're saying this stuff is. The National League of Cities has published a similar document with more of a slant towards what local governments need to be worried about, which makes sense, right? Not Council of Nonprofits helps nonprofits. National League of Cities is for cities. And they're saying, hey, we're not talking about a small technical tweak. This is a big deal. And so, in other words, nonprofits, cities, everybody, if you receive federal grants, you need to sit up and pay attention and not be like, yeah, it'll be fine. There's always rules. Yes, but what those rules are matter, right?
They really do. And again, now is the time to review them and make comments. And again, toward the end of this episode, Amanda's and I are going to share some tips for how to go about making good comments. Spoiler alert, just adding your email to some like petition letter is not going to have the effect that you think it's going to have. So that's why we're wanting to break it down. We want you to read and think for yourself, obviously, and see these things. So this is our opinion and the opinions of organizations that we trust, that we look to stay on top of these, like National Council of Nonprofits and National League of Cities, among others. So let's just dive on into it. Let's get into it. And when I was thinking about how to put this together, my brain tends to work in buckets, like buckets of information, buckets of revenue in different forms, different buckets for each thing. So I group this in my mind in three major buckets. Again, this is not the totality of the document because this is not a 4-hour episode, right? Because no, but so in my mind, I was like, okay, there are three. And the first one is increased administrative burden on grantees. The second is making federal funding more uncertain and more unstable. We're going to go through each of these. And the third, the one that is really getting under my skin, is politicizing federal grant making and grant management. So just the whole thing, we've seen evidence of it already, and it will change. It's moving power into a place that's outside the more or less mostly okay if onerous process of grant review, and it's politicizing it. So we're going to be talking about those three things: administrative burden on grantees, and then the second, more unstable, uncertain funding, and then the third is politicizing grant making. So that's kind of where we're going to be living in this.
Fabulous. Well, not fabulous, but I like your three buckets is what I'm saying. That makes
sense.
Okay, so right now, federal grants are already a major administrative undertaking. If you've ever managed a federal grant before, you know it is a lot to juggle. So there's the application process, which, heck, I'd even start further back than that. Right now, is the grant even available and going to go live process? Because grants I have been tracking so many grants that were supposed to be posted in May, and either they still have that forecasted posting date of May, which has come and gone, or it's like every week they just keep pushing it back, which, while not the end of the world, but when I'm watching like 20 grants that are doing this, and that's just for one consulting firm. I cannot fathom what other agencies. Anyway, so from that process to the grant writing process and getting your application submitted through all the different portals and headaches and things about that. Then you've got the award management, you've got reporting, you've got auditing, you've got to make sure you're compliant with all of these different things. It's a lot before you then stockpile more onto that. So it's already a lot to juggle.
It's a lot anyway, and it's never been particularly streamlined, although it's gotten a little bit better over the years, I'll say that. But the capacity required to manage federal grants, especially for smaller organizations, was enormous anyway, and it's going to get worse if these changes are pushed through.
Yep. So like we said, more work coming our way if this gets approved. So for example, one of the proposed changes is that it would require all payment requests from grantees, including municipalities, nonprofits, everybody, would have to include written justifications describing the purpose of each payment and the specific award-related work it supports. So like right now, when I turn when I go for a reimbursement process, right? As long as what I'm purchasing matches our approved budget, all I have to do is turn in an invoice that matches it, like, hey, budget line item 5 says, we can buy 500 doodads. So then I turn in my invoice that shows 500 doodads, and then I have a copy of the receipt to show where we purchased 500 doodads. That's the documentation that's required. But now you're going to have to, it's almost like you're having to write a mini grant proposal to explain this is why we needed it, and this is why we bought it, and this is what it exactly is.
Which is in the grant, it's in the grant proposal, and it's in the budget, and it's in the grant agreement. So this is like, this is some busy work that's going to cause, and then giving them another chance to go, oh yeah, no, this doesn't meet our ideological stance on whatever.
Well, and you think, oh, Amanda, what's the big deal? Well, like, I worked at I would say medium-sized city. And at one point in time, I was managing 44 grants, the majority of which were either federal or federal pass-through grants. So I cannot fathom every month having to do this. It was already a lot to juggle what I was juggling. I cannot imagine having to do that and add that right there is already increasing. I'm like, already I would be like, I'm going to need at least a part-time employee to help me just with the reimbursement request process. And again, I wasn't working for like a city of Atlanta or, New York City. Can you imagine, LA? Like, whew. Anyway.
And I feel like it's just gonna slow everything down. It reminds me of when Kristi Noem, she was over DHS? No, wherever she was when she wasn't making all those commercials with her on horseback and whatever in her little cowboy cosplay. She was like, oh, I need to sign everything having to do with FEMA disaster relief. And so the bottleneck was stretched into weeks and weeks and weeks and months, because that's just nuts. Having the director of a huge agency eyeball and sign every single thing. Now, should everybody be spending money the right way, and do we need checks and balances? 100%. But come on, it's making grants more and more painful to manage. And I can't help but think maybe it's so that people will give up and not apply for them. Or then it makes it easy for the administration to control them even more. Another thing that's coming up in this administrative burden increase that I found, and that Amanda's found from reviewing these proposed changes, all recipients and subrecipients would be required to participate in DHS's E-Verify program for any work associated with federal grants. So if you're hiring staff on a federally funded program, you need to run them through E-Verify. So that's in addition to what we already are required to do, which is use E-Verify for federal contractors, but not typically for grant recipients and not necessarily for grant-funded staff. So,
yeah, and I mean, I know, like, when I worked in local government, we had to do it anyway. So it's, for some agencies, you might be like, I'm already doing that. That's not a big deal. Yeah. Right. But not every agency is doing that. They're not, because they haven't been required. And so again, that's just, you're placing an additional step, an additional burden on particularly smaller nonprofits doing that. Right. And so it's going to, again, it's more work. Right. And here's the question. Has this really been a big problem that federal grants were paying the salaries of illegal immigrants? I don't know. I haven't seen proof of it.
Or hiring domestic terrorists, for example, or whatever it is that this problem is. I would say no.
Yeah. So, and then the Buy American provisions have been added. Certainly right now, Buy American applies to all infrastructure related grants, but I will say I have seen it apply in other instances as well. So this is one I'm not too terribly upset with, because I feel like I'm not surprised this is coming, and it's already happening. And to me, this is not a huge, as far as paperwork and timing goes, it really is just more weeding out. I'm not buying things from other countries, right? I'm buying.
What if there's no domestic supplier?
Now that's a good question. Yeah, and I don't know. Is there a workaround for that if there is no domestic supplier? I don't know.
didn't see one. I didn't see one spelled out. And if this is going to be going into as a regulation versus guidance, it's like you'd still be held to this requirement to buy domestically, but what if it's a medical product that's made in Belgium or Switzerland or something like that? I guess we'll just MacGyver something, with a Ford Pinto and a smile. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it could just be. Go ahead.
Well, going back to as you're listening to all this and thinking about some of these things we may be talking about, you may be at your organization going, actually, we already do that, or actually, that's not a big deal. And we're not saying one of these bullet points you need to be commenting on, but you need to be listening going, ooh, that's going to affect me. So if you're an organization that does medical research and you're like, we get things from other countries because we have to for X, Y, and Z, those are the things you need to be going, here's a problem and here's why. And have you thought through what the ramifications are and what the workarounds are, right? So again, that one didn't bother me as much, but it doesn't affect me, right? So I hadn't thought about it in that regard. But if it's affecting you and your organization, you definitely need to be speaking up and saying something about it.
We get into comments later on. I would recommend, if it doesn't affect your organization or your client directly, then focus on the things that do and be very, very specific about those instead of commenting like, this all sucks, it's going to make it harder for everybody. That's really not where we need to be. But again, buy America if it makes sense, but if it doesn't make sense, if there's no workaround, this could be really tricky for organizations doing specialized work.
Yep. So another thing they're discouraging is cost reimbursement contracts, which I'm like, then what's your option? You wait till the very end and pay them all? Because I think about how many times you're hiring contractors for huge jobs, right? We would hire an engineering firm and it may take 9 months to design something. We may be hiring a construction firm to build a road or an interstate. I mean, I've seen some road projects happen over the course of years, right? Depending on the size of the scope. And so if you're not, and those reimbursements are usually, hey, we did this much work this month. You're looking to make sure it's legit, and then you're paying them back for the month. But if they're saying you can't pay them until the very end, first of all, what vendor is going to be sure for the next 3 years I'll be out a paycheck, but at the very end you'll pay me?
Or at the very least, if you're having to bring on all this extra justification, even though it was already in the budget, and each time you're asking for payment, you have to do that, it is definitely going to slow things down. Yeah. And so then you're on the hook with your contractors or your subrecipients. Nobody can do the work until the money gets going.
Well, and to me, this begs the question of who wrote this stuff? Have they never seen any of the documentation? Because I'm thinking about anytime I've had, say, a construction project, we get what is called an application for payment, or an AFP. So every month, the contractor would submit paperwork that included the itemized budget that they were we contracted with them to do, and they would have to detail for each of those how much money, and they would have some narrative talking about, hey, this week we put in the rebar for the road, or we did this section, or we did lighting this week and we put up 20 lights. So a lot of that stuff is already in, like, kind of the AFP is kind of the invoice basically from our contractor. So the fact that that is not enough, that then I'm going to have to go back and write something that is basically already what's written in our invoices, like, that's, again, who wrote this?
I don't think the purpose is, we really want to tighten up. I think the purpose is to make it so very, very difficult that I think that's just one of the purposes, to make it so very difficult that people just will give up, literally. Yeah. That agencies won't apply for these things or they can't handle it. And it's not like this administration is really into making things easier around social services for people in disadvantaged communities. That's just not what they're doing.
Yeah. So, and so National League of Cities especially pointed out this section because, and I'm just thinking, I'm going to guesstimate, but I would guess that 80% of the federal grants I worked on had to do with, we had some sort of contract with a vendor that was doing some sort of work like this, where it was a monthly type of thing. So again, going back to, I can't even fathom how much more time that would take me. or someone else on our staff to document to do that. That would be a lot. So, and again, going back to, I was a medium-sized city, so small, rural, and under-resourced communities that are already stretched thin. I mean, federal grants are difficult enough for even a big agency. They're already so hard for small agencies. This is just going to add to it.
And just to note, if you are watching us on YouTube and we're looking down a lot, we just had to make lots of notes for this. So, sorry, I'm not making my usual rubber faces and reacting to things. I'm just trying to make sure we get on to everything. And speaking of that, we want to move on to the bucket 2. Remember, I had those sort of 3 thought buckets of how to do this. So bucket 2, funding uncertainty. So we've been talking about this and writing about this for a long time. Ever since the second Trump administration came in, how federal grants were paused right in January of when he first took office. And then there was DOGE. And then there was the government shutdown that was like biblical proportions, like literally 40 days or longer. And it just changed everything in terms of, Amanda, like you said earlier, about what are the deadlines, what are the requirements, they would change. It's open, it's closed, it's open. You have 2 days, you have 2 weeks. So that was a lot of the chaos was pre-award. But literally, this can be the other shoe dropping. And I'm not trying to sound alarmist, but it was like, think back to the uncertainty around pre-award work around federal grants and federal pass-through grants to states and other entities. And then now we're moving into grant management. If there are going to be changes because it doesn't look like someone has done this deep level dive into, uniform guidance doesn't say specifically how to do things. So how will this work if Buy America is the only way to go and there's vital equipment? There's not a lot of work around. It doesn't seem like a lot of thought. So the proposed changes that are coming through right now that we're talking about would just add multi-layers of uncertainty on top of all that.
Yeah. It would basically allow federal agencies to terminate a grant award now, which they're allowed to now, right? But there's certain, like, you're terminating a grant because an agency is stealing or the program hasn't had any movement in 6 months. Like, there are legit reasons for something to be terminated. And I'm not mad at that. In fact, I would say that some grants do need to be terminated. But here, they're giving agencies power to terminate a grant award during the period of performance if the funder or someone decides that the award no longer aligns with program goals or executive branch policies at the time of terminations. And that last part is important, right? It no longer. So it aligned initially. You followed all the rules and guidelines when you wrote the grant.
You got the grant. You got the grant.
An award agreement. Go forth, and you've been doing it, and you've been getting reimbursed, and things are going well. And suddenly, the executive branch decides, I don't like this anymore, right? So it has nothing to do with the policies that were in place when you wrote the grant or received the grant. It's policies happening whatever day they decide that they may want to terminate your grant.
And sort of compounding that, federal agencies could withhold discretionary grants indefinitely if the funding agency determines that the grant doesn't advance, and this is in quotes, advance the president's policy priorities. That's language directly from National Council of Nonprofits analysis. And they write, advance the president's policy priorities is not an objective measure. And again, this could be 2 years later, 1 year later, 6 months later. Yeah.
Right. And on top of that, being proposed that this is allowable, there are going to be limited appeal rights under this process. So when a grant is terminated under this discretionary authority, the agency would not have to provide grantees with an administrative hearing or an appeals process. That means you could lose your grant and have little or no recourse.
That's pretty much the absence of due process for organizations that have invested significant time and resources. Like, due process, what's that? Who would play her? It's like, so then if you are hiring a position, which with federal funding you're often doing, is completely grant funded, who's going to want that job? How are you going to move things forward? And more importantly, how is the community that you say you're serving, how is this even going to work if at any time it could be taken away? It's like, if this is like the emperor says kind of stuff, it's just really, there's no way to make commitments to community members or to rely on the funding. And again, I'm talking about funding that was already reviewed and awarded. They're saying now, oh, well, if we decide that what's going on doesn't meet our current priorities, then we can just stop the funding and there's really nothing you can do.
Yep. And we're just going to keep piling on here because that's what's in these proposed changes, right? So this stood out to me, and I know we're trying not to get political. It infuriates me. So the proposal.
I'm 100% political. They're getting political with me. Come on, let's go. Let's go, y'all. Let's go. Come on.
So the proposed changes would require pass-through entities. So these are federal agency gives money to an organization, oftentimes a state agency, but it could be a large university or whatever, and then they subaward to other agencies. So if you are one of those pass-through agencies, meaning you receive federal funds and you subaward even one grant or 12 or 12,000 to other agencies, as the pass-through entity, you would have to ensure that your subrecipients, whether it's a local government, a nonprofit, a school system, whatever, but these subrecipients don't take actions that could significantly damage the reputation of the pass-through entity, the federal agency, or the federal government. So really nothing to do with the grant program that's happening, but if said entity does anything that the federal government decides that's harmful to us, then that pass-through entity could be directed to terminate that grant.
Sure.
Especially if even if a subrecipient's public statements are deemed, in quotes, reputationally harmful. So in other words, if you want federal grants, you probably don't get freedom of speech anymore, is basically what this.
100%. I mean, and reputationally harmful. What the hell is that? It's like, I could argue that it's reputationally harmful to have USC fights on the White House lawn. I mean, what's next? Are we going to put cars on bricks and, have a still in the back? I mean, it's just, and I say that as a white person from the South. So, I mean, I feel like I can say that. But reputationally harmful. Again, this isn't a regulation. This is just someone's opinion. And we're going to get into who those people might be with those opinions. I mean, who decides that? It's just ridiculous.
Well, so many of these things are just, whether you agree with them or not, I hope we can all agree that it's vague, right? There isn't, it's so much is left open to interpretation, and an interpretation of who? Anybody who wants to interpret it one way or the other. And that, no matter whether you agree with it or not, that is harmful to not be like specific versus just reputationally harmful. Whatever.
So we're moving on to the third of three buckets, and this is the concern that these proposed changes would politicize federal grant making. This is the one that has the broadest coalitions of organizations alarmed, not just the two organizations that we've brought into this discussion, but many, many, many others as well. It's across the political spectrum, right? Federal grant making is allegedly, for all the grief that I've felt over the years working on federal grants, whether pre-award, post-award, or the wonderful world of grant reviewing, it's supposed to be grounded in objective criteria. And I know, Amanda, one of the things that you said you love so much about federal and public funding versus private funding is that everything's spelled out.
Yes,
or it's pretty darn close to being spelled out. You may not like all the questions they're asking and all the documentation, but it's all listed there. Mm-hmm. And there's supposed to be, program effectiveness, demonstrating community need, your agency's capacity to handle the funds, congressional intent about how appropriated funds should be used. But it's actually my concern is that several provisions in these proposed changes would make it easier to award or deny grants based on political considerations rather than those objective factors. Have people been political with grant making before? Yes. It's called pork belly. Sure. Was it perfect? No. But this is like straight up saying, if we feel that something you're doing is reputationally harmful in any way to whatever we think is our reputation and how we define it, but we're not going to tell you what that is, then and we'll get into it about we're going to disrupt the review process and do all these other things. It's just like it's taking it might as well be major donor work where it's the donor can often, not always. I have personally experienced really great major donor interactions and people who really do want to make a difference. And then there are other people who weaponize their money and want you to do things a certain way, or they'll take their money away. And that's kind of what we're moving into here. So I'm just saying.
Yeah. So one of these talked about provisions is something called pre-issuance review. Okay. So before the grant is awarded, or even selected for funding, political appointees at each agency. So not program staff who've been doing this and who have the expertise. They're not bringing in consultants or outside experts, right? So Kimberly and I have both been grant reviewers before because we've got expertise in certain areas and we can help with reviewing of different things. So we're not talking that just a political appointee would review whether the proposal is consistent with, and I'm putting this in quotes, applicable law, federal agency priorities, and the national interest.
And you may be asking yourself, but wait, didn't someone have to approve these RFPs in the first place? And didn't the language, isn't it already very clear? And they're usually 5 extra things like in a lot of SAMHSA and DOJ grants now, 2 different agencies, but around, it has to be American citizens only and you can't harm citizens and That's already there. That's already there. So, but now you got somebody who's a political appointee in there just going, well, is this in the national interest if you have a food pantry, but you don't know if everyone coming to the food pantry is getting food from someplace else? I'm just making up an example here, but it's just having somebody, this random person who's politically appointed, again, who knows if there are any credentials or anything, because as we have seen, that's not always what gets people into major leadership positions in this or other administrations. So, it's just taking, politicizing it even further. And so the political appointees would get a veto over everyone else. And that's just not right.
Yep. Well, and grantees would not be notified if their proposal was screened out through this process or shared why. So right now, one of the things I do love about federal grants is whether you're selected or not, you're allowed to get your reviews and your scores and your reviewer comments. So it's very easy to understand, no wonder I didn't get selected, or, oh, here's some areas where I need to improve upon. But if you're screened out through this process, there is no feedback for you to understand why it happened. And which anytime there's not transparency, which by the way, is one of the buckets that the federal government says they're trying to do, when you're cutting out that transparency, that is causing problems. So if you're submitting a competitive application, you may never know why you were removed, which means you may not, if that's the first round, you won't even make it to the merit review. So then you don't even know, how would I have scored? Was my application good? Which is going to hurt you. And you're like, well, so you don't get the grant. What does it matter why you don't get the grant? Well, it matters because if you're going to apply again, you need to understand, because if I was pulled out for some political thing, then maybe I don't ever apply again. Or would that political focus change the next year? Because since it's not written down anywhere, it's just up to the political appointee to decide. If it's a different political appointee next year, would they let us slide through because they have different beliefs? I don't
know. It also sort of flies in the face of these are public documents and it's public information, federal grant applications I'm talking about. And so that's why you're able to, or you used to be able to, go through the Freedom of Information Act if you couldn't get it any other way. So I guess we're just going to circumvent that too, because transparency.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's see. The National Council of Nonprofit raises concerns about how this could be weaponized, right? So the proposal directs agencies to consider a grantee's membership in or affiliation with organizations that, and again, I quote, undermine public safety or national security. And then, and a grantee's engagement in, again in quotes, activities inconsistent with federal civil rights laws. Again, those terms are not clearly defined,
Nope.
which is the pattern of these proposed changes. It's got this broad, undefined language that creates room for a subjective, politically inflected enforcement. So in other words, it goes back to, I don't care what your proposal says, you're an organization that plays in the sandbox with this other organization that we don't like, so we're not giving you funding. That's what it reads.
Right. That's kind of what it is.
Yeah.
For sure.
I can imagine this, especially people who are doing advocacy work or working with certain populations are going to be the ones that are hit probably the most.
I'm just thinking about a proposal that I worked on as kind of a peer consultant relationship. So it wasn't my client directly, but they provide services for kids who are runaways, basically, and because of our society, a lot of these kids are kicked out of their homes if they come out to their parents, and so it's like we've already had to reframe language around, reuniting families is the primary goal. I'm like, yes, the same families who have kicked them out in the first place, but it's just sort of taking it a step further into, I guess, if you don't fit a very narrow but not very well defined vision of what the work should be and who should receive that work, we're not going to tell you what that is, but if you don't fit it, too bad for you. And we're not going to tell you why it's too bad. You're just not going to ever know. And you have no recourse and you have no appeal process. So I don't know, Amanda, maybe it's time to move into a how do we take action moment here.
We can do that. So the important thing that any of us can do, so whether this is the first you're hearing about it or you've been hearing about these changes since they dropped several weeks ago, is to submit a public comment. Okay. So, and I want to emphasize that, yes, your comment matters, right? Even if you've never done this before, I'll be honest, I have never submitted public comments for uniform guidance, but darn tootin', I'm doing it this year. I got lots of thoughts and feelings. So, it's an official part of the regulatory process. Federal agencies are required to review and respond to substantive comments.
That's true. And the key word is substantive. I said this at the top of the hour when we got started with this, the form letters where you're feeling good about yourself because you're like, I'm an activist because I clicked on something and added my name to it. That's not what this is. That's not what this is. And that doesn't have the effect that you think it does. I did not check it this morning. The last time I checked, I want to say there were 16,000 comments already in. And if you're listening to this going, oh, well, everybody's already doing it, I don't need to do it. I'm like, yes, you do. Yes, you do. And
America, 16,000 is a drop in the bucket.
Is a drop in the bucket. And you may be like, well, they can just do all these changes anyway, whether or not I comment. I'm like, and I sure they could. But if you don't comment, then it's kind of like, for me, it's kind of like when people don't vote. I'm like, then you better shut up around me when things don't go. I get it. How many candidates have I voted for that don't get elected? I get it. But I'm also like, then you don't get to come and go, well, why is all this and nah, nah, nah. And I'm like, because you wanted other people to take on this burden of resisting these changes. It doesn't have to be inevitable. It really doesn't. And this is like the tamest form of collective action that you could take. You're simply saying these rules and regulations will harm this agency and their clients in these very specific ways. So for me, I think I would recommend to get attention, be specific and connect it to your real experience. And if you're angry about this and you're tired, I feel you, but this is not the place to talk about how angry you are and what idiots are that created this. This is to be very specific, in my opinion, about what the harm will be and why it's a bad idea. Around it could be a proposed rule or reg in any of those buckets that we talked about. And we'll have links so that you can go and pick the particular things and then refer to it. And I know, Amanda, you've got more details about that, but it's just being specific and describing how the changes will affect you.
Yep. Because you want them to pay attention. If you're being like, y'all suck, nah, they're just going to glaze over and stop reading. So
Yeah.
be specific, like she said. Here's a structure that I think would work really well. You want to start by introducing yourself. So your name, your title, your organization, and maybe an overall sentence about how your organization serves your community specifically through federal grants, right? Then you want to concretely explain how specific proposed changes would affect your organization, right? Not in the abstract. Be specific about it, right? Name actual section numbers if you can. Describe actual programs that would have been disruptive. Quantify impacts where possible, dollar amounts, number of people served, staff time, those kinds of things. Then close it with a clear ask, either to withdraw specific provisions or to abandon that rule entirely. And yes, we are saying use your name. So like these are public comments. So it is part of the public domain. So you need to know that going in as well.
But honestly, if you're afraid to use your name to just say, hey, I'm having a political appointee instead of a grants process, review grants, and then giving my organization no feedback on why we didn't get the grant will not help us make more competitive grants in the future to better serve our community. If that is too controversial for you, I mean, think it through. That's it. That can be a very real reality. And it might be whether or not you make the comments, but I think it's so important to show up and participate in ways that make sense for you.
Yeah.
Do you want to, I know we've gone through so many things, Amanda, do you want to just do a quick overview of how to go to regulations.gov and do all that stuff? Do you want to just walk people through that? It'll be in our show notes, but I think it would be helpful. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you want me to get you started or?
No. So to do this, you're going to go to regulations.gov and you're going to search for docket number OMB-2026-0034. And we'll put that in the show notes as well.
Yep.
Okay? Or you can go directly to the document page, which will have the link as well. Because if I'm reading it out, it's not going to help you. And there's a blue comment button right on that page, right? And you're allowed to type up to 5,000 characters directly in the text box. Or for a longer submission, you could attach a PDF document.
And so to make sure that your comments are clearly tied to this rulemaking and these other things we've talked about, what do you want people to do? I'm assuming it's make that reference to OMB 2026-0034, right? Because
if you didn't know, there's lots of things that are open for comment right now. So this is not the only thing. So yeah, you want to make sure that you are referencing that OMB-2026-0034. Office of Management and Budget Regulation for Federal Financial Assistance in your comments. So that ensures it's properly linked to the right docket. And a few practical notes: keep your tone respectful, even if you're strongly opposed. Assume everything you submit is going to be made public. So don't include personal home addresses or phone numbers. And whatever you do, don't miss the July 13th deadline. They do not have to accept comments after that. And my guess is they won't. So July 13th, get it in before then.
And we have other, I think we could probably just put these in the show notes because you're right. If we just read out a bunch of email addresses and phone numbers, people are going to be like, what? So we've got their names. And if you're having trouble making comments, we've got emails and names of folks that can help you out. Allegedly, there's a help desk and we have that phone number. And I would say, I know this is something near and dear to your heart, but I would say share, not only do it yourself, but just share it and let people know. That's why we're doing this podcast. Just let people know, but get on it and let people know because it closes July the 13th, 2026.
Yeah, I'd share with your board, with peers, with colleagues, elected officials, just anybody you know who has a stake in this. You certainly want to share that with them. And if you've got a step-by-step guide on how to do it to make it easier for them, pass it. That's something I would do with my elected officials when I needed them to do something. I made it as simple as possible.
It's kind of like writing letters of support for people. You make it as simple as possible, draft it for them to review. These are transferable skills.
Yeah,
these are transferable skills.
League of Cities is even encouraging municipalities to send letters to their members of Congress. And it doesn't just have to be cities. Nonprofits, school systems, hospitals, whoever this is affecting, tribal governments, the same comments you're sharing, put that in a letter and send that. Call your congressmen and women, let them know, hey, we have a problem with this.
Yeah, I think it's the broader principle for me, and I know we've gone through a lot of minutia, and we scratched the surface of what we felt were the most egregious changes, the most harmful changes. There are many more. There might even be some positive ones in there, but the ones I found were more like, let's make it clear to understand. And Amanda, you said, oh yeah, clear to understand how bad it is. I mean, for me, the positives, the negatives far, far outweigh the positives rather. But for me, the broader principle at stake here is just the integrity of the federal grant making system. It has been imperfect for years. It's been imperfect since I started writing grants, but it's in my experience, it's the proposed changes have never been so vague, but yet so far-reaching, so ill-defined, but also so politicized. I feel like this is a new era of and federal grants made with tax dollars, right? I mean, that's where the money comes from. It's not coming from billionaires. It's not. It definitely isn't, because they rarely pay taxes anyway, right? So, it's all about the public. It's about the public. That's you and me and everyone. Investment in communities and health, education, housing, safety, economic development. I mean, the grant making process should have been less onerous, but it definitely needs to be fair and objective. And yeah, there need to be rules and regulations. And we can't have nice things, because people over the years have grifted and committed fraud and done all the things. But these proposed changes aren't really going to fix that. They're just adding extra layers of administrative burden. They're adding extra reporting and justifying things that were already approved in the budget, or they're allowing a political appointee who may or may not have any experience come in and make these decisions.
Well, and I'm just thinking back to some of the examples, because you and I almost every year do a rip from the headlines about where people have, cheated and lied. The additional steps they're requiring are not going to fix that, right? Because if I'm lying about an invoice, a write-up about how it works is just me writing whatever I want.
You can be writing that lie.
Exactly. So I'm like, if they really want to stop fraud, they need to fund more program officers. There needs to be more site visits. There needs to be more boots on the ground. I mean, there are ways. Put Kimberly and I in charge. We can give you some good suggestions, right, on how to fix the fraud that does happen, because it does, right? That's just, we can't have nice things, as Kimberly said. It doesn't matter whether you're dealing with $100 or $100 trillion when it comes to grant funding. Somebody is going to find a way to use it for personal gain, because there are human beings involved in the process, whether it's at the federal level or all the way down to the final subrecipient, right? Somewhere along that line, something is going to happen. There are ways to help stop that, but just adding more paperwork for what they're asking for is not, it's not going to do what they're claiming this is going to do. So that's another of my frustrations. Like, if you're trying to have transparency and accountability, this does not get us there.
I don't really think that's what they're trying to do.
Well, I
really don't think that's what this is about. And these provisions, if they come to pass, are going to introduce a level of subjectivity and political influence into this, what used to be a fairly apolitical process. I'm not talking about pork barrel deals done in some back room in a DC bar. I'm talking about the grants process for clinical research, or the NEA or SAMHSA or
DOT or FEMA.
DOT, DOJ, EPA, DOE, all the things. And this is eroding trust in the system and grants over time. And for people who are not familiar with the process at all, then that can also backfire all over nonprofits and just governments in general. And that it could be a really damaging outcome just overall.
Yeah. And all of that's worth fighting for. So share information with others. And if you're like, I don't know what to share this podcast episode with them. It's a simple, you can text it. You're listening on your phone. You can text it, email it to anybody. So go ahead and do that.
Copy and paste the show notes, send them out. That's what they're there for.
Yep. But we know this was a lot, but we're glad you're here.
Thanks again to today's sponsor, the Encore Institute for Social Impact. If you want to learn more about this fantastic team whose goal is to bring healthy, sustainable success to your organization, visit EncoreISI.com. You'll find the link in our show notes.
Okay, so that was certainly a lot to absorb in one episode. As we've already said, all the things we've talked about, how to do your comments, who to reach out to if things aren't working, where to find synopsis of all of these things, all of those are in the show notes. So to make it easy for you to find and get your comments in.
And July 13th will be here before you know it, because this year, this space-time continuum that we are in is really moving fast. So please don't wait. Sit down this week, write your comment in your own words, describe your specific experiences, because your voice matters. Your voice matters.
Yeah, because if this episode is dropping on July 9th, which means you only have a handful of days if you're listening to this, so get on it. So, but no matter when you're listening, we're so honored that you are here with us. You chose to spend time with us. Grant writing is hard, important, meaningful work, and we're so glad to be your companions on this journey. We hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks, where we are talking about ways to advocate for your agency, the communities you serve, and the grant profession. So talk about a little love after this episode. So we hope you'll join us in 2 weeks.
Bye.